Miley Cyrus didn't just grow up famous. She grew up inside a character, watched, judged, and memed while her real self was still forming. That's why her then versus now is so addictive. It isn't a simple glow-up. It's a full identity escape. The world met Hannah Montana and tried to keep Miley frozen there forever, but Miley kept breaking the frame, again and again, until the Disney Kid label couldn't hold her anymore. And here's the hook. If you look closely at the earliest footage, there's a quiet childhood clue that explains everything: why she reinvents so hard, why she shocks people, and why the transformation is more about survival than style. This is before the fame files, and today we're opening Miley's folder from the beginning, before the stadium headlines, before the controversy cycles, before the internet decided it owned her every era. We're going to track the pattern. The first audition energy, the moment she becomes a household name, the box that fame builds around a teen, and the exact switch where then turns into now. Because the real question isn't, how did she change? The real question is, what did Miley learn as a kid that taught her how to outgrow the version of her the world loved most? Miley's before fame footage has a specific energy that's easy to miss if you only remember her as the headline-making adult. In the early clips, she's bright and playful, but there's also a sharp awareness behind the smile, like she already understands she's being evaluated. She doesn't perform like a kid who is simply having fun. She performs like a kid who knows the room is a test. That's the first clue. Even young Miley carries a sense of readiness, the instinct to turn charisma on demand, to meet expectation, to win approval quickly. And when a child learns that approval can change everything, performing stops being a hobby and starts becoming identity. The second clue is that Miley's confidence is built on contrast: sweetness on the surface, stubbornness underneath. In childhood moments, she often reads as warm and funny, the kind of kid audiences instantly root for. But there's a stubborn spark too, a refusal to be small. That spark is what makes her rise feel inevitable, and it's also what makes her later rebellions feel personal. Because once the world tells you, this is who you are, a stubborn kid doesn't quietly accept it. A stubborn kid starts looking for exits. Miley's earliest years show someone who wants to be loved, yes, but also someone who wants to be chosen for her real self, not just a character she can play. And here's the clue that ties directly into her then versus now: performance as armor. For Miley, stepping into a role isn't only acting, it becomes a protective layer. When you grow up in the industry, you learn to manage impressions before people can attack you. You learn to control the narrative before it controls you. Miley's childhood clue suggests she's wired for that kind of strategy. She can be adorable on camera, but she can also flip the script when she feels boxed in. That's why her later transformation isn't random or just for shock. It's the adult version of a childhood survival skill. If the world traps you in an image, you break the image first. And the next part is where that survival skill finds its biggest weapon: the first audition, the first break, and the moment she becomes a household name before she's old enough to decide whether she even wants it. Miley's first spark becomes real the moment audition energy turns into opportunity, when the industry stops seeing her as a kid who can perform and starts seeing her as a product that can carry a franchise. The early audition footage is the kind of thing fans replay for years because it's so clear. The confidence isn't fake, but it's also not carefree. Miley shows up like someone who already understands the assignment: be charming, be memorable, and prove you can hold a room. That's the moment the file begins to tighten, because the better she performs, the faster the world moves toward claiming her. Then comes the break that changes everything: the leap from hopeful performer to household name. This is where before they were famous becomes, you can't walk outside without being recognized. The character she's attached to becomes a cultural shortcut. People don't just watch the show. They start watching her, measuring her, projecting onto her, treating her like a symbol for an entire generation of teen entertainment. And because Miley's childhood clue is that readiness and stubborn spark, she adapts fast. And that's the first real cost. The label arrives before Miley has finished becoming herself. The audience loves her, but they also lock her into a role, sometimes literally, sometimes emotionally. The industry rewards her for being the perfect version of a character, and the public starts confusing Miley with the image they bought. When you become famous that young, you don't just gain opportunities, you lose the right to grow in private. Every change becomes a headline, every experiment becomes scandal, every step away from the original image feels like betrayal to someone who thinks they own your childhood. This is how the box forms, love that turns into expectation. And the next part is where the box becomes unavoidable, the Disney era at full power, where Miley is adored loudly and labeled even louder. Disney doesn't just make Miley famous, it turns her into a comfort symbol. This is the era where she becomes the girl everyone knows, the face that lives on posters, lunchboxes, TV promos, award show seats, and endless interview clips. On the surface, it's pure success. She's adored, she's everywhere, she's the definition of a cultural moment. But inside the Before the Fame Files folder, this is where the pressure turns invisible and constant. Because the more the public loves you as a brand, the less space you have to be a person. Miley isn't just performing a role, she's performing stability, sweetness, and family-friendly safety on command, even while she's still trying to figure out who she is off camera. And then the label hardens into rules. The world stops seeing Miley and starts seeing the Disney version of Miley, and any deviation feels like a violation to people who think they own your image. Growth becomes suspicious, experimentation becomes scandal, even silence becomes a headline. This is the real cage of the box era, love that turns into expectation. Miley's childhood clue, readiness plus stubborn spark, starts fighting back here because she can feel the trap closing. The same machine that made her huge also tries to freeze her in one identity forever. And once you feel frozen, the next move isn't a gentle evolution, it's an escape plan. That's why the next chapter is inevitable. The switch, the reinvention, the moment then, stops being a comparison and becomes a breakaway. This is the chapter where Miley's then versus now stops being a cute slideshow and becomes a turning point that rewires how the public talks about her. Because once you've lived inside a box long enough, you either shrink to fit it or you break it. Miley breaks it. And the first thing you notice is how intentional the shift feels. The sweet Disney kid aura doesn't just fade, it gets replaced by something sharper, an adult presence that isn't asking for permission to grow up. This isn't only rebellion, it's a declaration. The image you loved was real, but it was not the whole person. The first layer of the switch is visual. Miley's style evolution becomes a signal to the world that she's changing the rules. Hair, fashion, stage energy, everything starts communicating new era. In the box era, the public expected consistency. Now Miley uses contrast as power. She turns shock into strategy, controlling attention before attention can control her. And this is why the transformation becomes so headline-friendly. The public can't ignore it. Even people who don't listen to her music recognize the moment she redraws her identity. The camera begins treating her differently too, not as a teen symbol, but as an unpredictable adult star who refuses to be managed the same way. The second layer is career control. Miley stops existing only as a brand extension and starts existing as an artist with choices. What she performs, how she performs, what she says no to, what she turns into her own narrative. Her voice becomes more than pop star vocals. It becomes a tool for mood, grit, emotion, and reinvention. She experiments with sounds and aesthetics in a way that signals one thing: she'd rather be criticized as herself than praised as a character. And that choice is expensive. Because once you break the Disney image, you don't just gain freedom, you inherit backlash from people who wanted you to stay safe. The third layer is the hardest: public reaction, pressure, and the cost of being seen. Reinvention invites respect, but it also invites scrutiny at a higher level. People don't simply watch Miley, they debate her. Every era becomes evidence in someone else's argument. The internet replays moments like a courtroom. And for a person whose childhood clue was readiness and stubborn spark, this is where the spark turns into survival skill. Miley learns that if the world insists on defining you, you can either fight for control or get swallowed. The switch gives her control, but it also makes her a target. And that's the cliffhanger leading into the next part. What happens when your transformation becomes so public that the noise never stops? That's where the story goes deeper, past headlines into pressure, fallout, and the work of healing while everyone's still watching. When Miley breaks the Disney frame, she doesn't just step into freedom, she steps into a louder kind of pressure, because the public doesn't treat reinvention like a normal human growing up. The public treats it like a verdict. Every change becomes something people feel entitled to judge. Too much, not enough, attention-seeking, brave, reckless, iconic. And the more famous you are, the less your story belongs to you. Miley's life becomes a debate stage where strangers argue about her identity as if it's their right. Social media amplifies everything. One clip becomes 1,000 opinions, one outfit becomes a week of headlines, one moment becomes a permanent reference point. This is the real cost of a viral transformation. Your growth gets frozen into screenshots. Then comes the fallout, moments where the noise isn't just annoying, it's exhausting. Because constant scrutiny does something specific to a person who grew up being on. It blurs the line between performance and self. Miley has to navigate the pressure of being misunderstood at scale while still being expected to entertain. And this is where her timeline gets more human than people assume. Behind the headlines, there are seasons where she recalibrates, where she experiments, regrets, learns, and rebuilds. The public sees eras.
Miley experiences seasons, trying to find a version of herself that doesn't require constant defense. The story gets deeper here because the question stops being, why did she shock people? And becomes, what did she need to survive that made shocking people feel like the only way out? And the healing arc is where the file reveals its real meaning.
Miley begins to develop a different kind of control, not the kind that commands attention, but the kind that protects peace. She learns when to step back without disappearing, when to speak without explaining everything, when to let an era end without dragging it into a comment section for closure. The adult version of her stubborn childhood spark becomes maturity, the ability to choose herself even when it disappoints strangers. She starts redefining success, not as being universally liked, but as being able to live with who she is when the cameras turn off. And that shift changes how the then versus now looks on screen. It's not only about style, it's about stability, about knowing what you're willing to share, what you refuse to perform, and what parts of you are no longer for sale. This is why Miley's story resonates beyond pop culture. It's not a simple rise and fall narrative. It's a grow up loud, heal in public, and still keep moving narrative. And it sets up the final payoff. If the world tried to turn her into a symbol, what does her story actually symbolize now? That answer is part 7, where we loop back to the childhood clue and see the transformation as a full circle, not a controversy timeline.
By the end of Miley Cyrus's Then versus Now, the transformation stops being about shock and becomes about meaning. Because Miley isn't compelling simply because she changed looks or broke rules. She's compelling because she refused to let the world decide who she was allowed to be. The public met a Disney-era symbol and expected her to stay frozen as their comfort version of Hannah Montana. But Miley grew up, and growing up in public is brutal. Every decision becomes a headline, every experiment becomes a verdict. Every mistake becomes a permanent clip. So the real story isn't she changed. The real story is that she survived being watched while changing and still came out with a voice that sounds like her own. Now loop back to the childhood clue we opened in part 2. That early readiness, that awareness that the room is a test, that stubborn spark behind the smile. When Miley was a kid, performance looked like a way to win approval. As she got older, that same performance became armor, control over how she was seen, control over what the public could reach. And once she realized the box would never unlock itself, she did what stubborn kids do. She broke it first. That's why her reinvention wasn't random. It was the adult version of a childhood survival skill. If the world traps you in an image, you change the image before it traps you completely. The payoff of this file is simple. Miley's now isn't the opposite of her then. It's the continuation of the same core, just protected better. She didn't delete her past. She outgrew it. She turned a character into a launch pad, turned criticism into fuel, and turned the noise into a lesson about boundaries. And that's why her timeline holds people. It reflects something real. Most of us don't have cameras following our growth, but we all know what it feels like to be misunderstood, to be labeled, to be pressured to stay the version of ourselves that other people prefer. So here's the open ending that keeps the audience hungry. Miley's story is still unfolding. The next era will always raise the same question. Will the world let her be human, or will it demand a character again? If you want the next file, comment which chapter you want next. The audition days, the Disney peak, the first breakaway, or the healing era. And subscribe to Before the Fame files, because the next Then vs. Now case is already waiting.